Hello everybody, and welcome to Independent Art Story Time. We're now well over halfway through The Box of Delights by John Masefield, and today we'll be reading the first part of chapter 8. As a quick recap, Mariah has been released from being scrobbled by the bad guys, and now Kay is dreaming about his guardian being trapped underwater in a cave. So, here we go with chapter 8. While he was looking through the letters that Ellen had brought in with the paper, "Oh, Master Kay," she said, "have you heard the news? The Bishop of Tatchester has disappeared." "What?" Kay said. "The papers are full of it," Ellen said. "The reverend gentleman went out of the palace last night for a brisk walk before going to bed according to his custom, and he hasn't come back since. Master Kay, oh, Master Kay." Kay opened the paper. "Startling disappearance of the Bishop of Tatchester. Considerable alarm was caused," he read, "in ecclesiastical circles last night when it was known that His Grace the Bishop of Tatchester had failed to return to the palace and was not heard of at the time of our going to press. The very reverend gentleman had passed the evening in the palace making ready for the Christmas season and in dispatching his Christmas cards to the clergy of his diocese, a duty that His Grace leaves no hand but his own. On conclusion of this pleasant duty, His Grace signified to his sister, Dame Eleanor Chosbel, that he would go for a brisk walk through the precincts before retiring to rest. According to her nightly custom, Dame Chosbel prepared tea for His Grace on his return. As he had not returned at the accustomed time, she proceeded through the precincts, but couldn't see him. At first she thought it likely that His Grace had joined some body of carol singers and might be singing carols in the neighbourhood, but at midnight, as he had not returned, she became alarmed and telephoned the Dean, who at once inquired at the hospital if His Grace had been the victim of some accident. But receiving a negative response, they communicated with the police, and although an active search was at once instituted, we regret to announce that no news has been received of His Grace's whereabouts. It will be remembered that the palace was the scene of a serious burglary the night before last, and it's thought that the bishop's disappearance may be connected to this earlier outrage. Dame Chosbel is confident that the bishop has no enemy who would lay violent hands upon him, and flaunts the opinion that he may have been subject suddenly to a loss of memory. The police are inclined to the view that the reverend gentleman may have received some shock from a passing motor car, which may have caused a temporary aberration. Anyone who may have seen anyone answering to the description of His Grace, or any occurrence which may seem to throw light on his disappearance, is earnestly asked to communicate with New Scotland Yard or with the Tatchester Constabulary on Tatchester 7000. Naturally, His Grace's disappearance has cast a gloom upon what would otherwise be a festal city. We would remind our readers that on Christmas Eve at midnight, His Grace hoped to celebrate the 1000th anniversary of the dedication of the cathedral, for which great occasion the usual Christmas decorations and expectations have been increased 1,000-fold. We are sure that we voice the feelings of thousands of our readers when we extend to Dame Chosbel our heartiest sympathy in her anxiety and liveliest hopes that His Grace may soon be restored to the bosom of his household and his diocese. Few figures in the church of today are more eminent for piety and the Christian virtues than His Grace, the very reverend Michael Chosbel, D.D. Our readers will remember that Dr. Chosbel in his younger days was a famous oarsman, long-distance runner, cricketer and heavyweight pugilist. In the scholastic field he carried away not only the prize for Greek verse, the Newdigate and Latin oration, and the Ponsford Laurel Crown for Hebrew, but he took first-class honours in natural science and in what are known as greats. Few people of his time at the university have attained such universal distinction in the provinces of both sport and learning. "I say," Kay said to himself when he'd read this, "now they've got the bishop. I won't mind betting it's the same gang and they're after with this box of delights and they think the bishop's got it." While he was meditating in the dining room, Peter came down. It was about 10 minutes past 8, and being a dark winter morning, it was hardly full daylight. "You look pretty gloomy, Kay," Peter said. "I am pretty gloomy," Kay said. They've scrobbled the bishop, and I'll bet it's the same people who scrobbled Mariah. And who do you think they are? Peter said. Well, I'm worried, Peter, Kay said. I know you think it's absurd, but I think they're the missionary college people out at Chester Hills. Would you come with me, Peter, he said, to Chester Hills and see what kind of a place it is? Well, I don't mind, Peter said. Shall we go after breakfast? I was thinking we might get there and back before breakfast, Kay said, leading the way to the door. Breakfast won't be till 9. And he paused just outside the door. It was a gloomy morning. How on earth could we get about 40 miles and back? Peter said. Kay caught hold of Peter's arm, and with his other hand he twitched the button on the magic box, and instantly both of them were plucked through the air in a northwesterly direction, so swiftly that they saw the fields and the brooks in the kind of blur beneath them. Then suddenly they were whirled downwards, and there they were, on a hillside, standing on what was the rampart of an old camp. Both the boys were a little out of breath. Now this is Chester Hills, Kay said. Look, there's Hope under Chester's, the railway station where the curates got into the train, and I believe picked my pockets. And you can see that this was once a Roman camp. This is the Chester. Well, where do you want to go now? Peter said. I think there, into that valley, Kay said. Looking down on the valley, the boys saw nothing but a great sea of woodland which began a little way below the camp and filled all the valley. But there were folds in the valley, and there what was in the folds they could not see. I say, it's lovely country, Peter said. I vote we go and explore in the woods. Kay first looked at the Roman camp. The line of the rampart was still firm and sharply cut, and the gates were just as they were when the Romans had marched out of them for the last time. Jolly good chaps, the Romans, Kay said. Oh, I don't know, said Peter. They were rather a mouldy lot. They were lucky tramps not to have to learn the Latin grammar, but to know it naturally. I don't know. I admire them enormously, Kay said. You see, we're 1,000 miles from Rome, and they hadn't any trains, they hadn't any steam, and they walked here, carrying all that they wanted on their backs. And when they came to sea, they made ships and sailed here. And when they were here, they made the only roads that we had that were any good for the next 1,800 years. And then the only baths that people took until about 50 years ago. You see, there you can see from the lie of the land that a road ran out of this gateway and down the hill. I bet if you had a spade to clear the turf away, you'd come across the pavement underneath. He led his way down the hill, and presently the line of the Roman track became more difficult to follow. When they came to the edge of the wood, the track was barred with a locked and chained gate, and there was a notice nailed to a tree. Trespassers will be prosecuted. On another tree there was a bigger notice. Danger! Man-traps and spring guns. The track inside the wood was hardly more than a narrow woodland path. The wood looked curiously foreboding and evil. It contained a great deal of yew and other dark evergreens, and the undergrowth was curiously grown, and in the darkness and wetness, with its profuse mass of close, sinister growth, it put a chill onto both boys' hearts. It doesn't look a very cheery place, Peter said. I don't think we ought to risk those notices. Oh, rats, Kay said. I don't believe in any of those notices. For years I was scared of a notice that said bloodhounds, but there wasn't a bloodhound within the county. Come along in. We better not talk much, and we won't make any noise. He clambered over the gate, and Peter followed. They went down the woodland track. It was a still, sinister wood, very thick covered, even for the depths of winter. As they went along it seemed to Kay that somewhere on his left hand there was the noise of water falling, much as he'd heard in his dreams. The little track led down the hill, and it wasn't straight, but bent and twisted. Peter went with a beating heart, but Kay went forward boldly. I say, Kay, Peter said, I wish you wouldn't hurry on like this. You ought to go cautiously. It's absolutely safe, Kay said. Do look. Nobody's been on this woodland track for weeks. But a keeper might come in any minute, Peter said. There aren't any keepers, Kay said. You can see that this place isn't preserved. If it were preserved, it should have seen pheasants long ago, or if not pheasants, we'd have seen keepers' vermin boards, or dead stoats and weasels and poor beautiful owls. Presently they passed from the woodland into a rather denser part that was more like a neglected shrubbery with azaleas and overgrown rhododendrons. In this part of the wood a very great deal of box had once been planted, but this had straggled and grown to a great height and made the wood even darker than it would have otherwise been, and there the track ended in a double line of box trees. No doubt the trees had once been trimmed into a box walk, but they were now all straggled and overgrown and untidy. Between the lines of box trees, however, a path that seemed to be in considerable use led from left to right, and through gaps in the dense shrubbery the boys saw the gleam of water just below them. "That'll be the lake," Kay said. "It's marked on the map. Let's go down and look at the water." They left the path and thrust through the shrubbery where it seemed thinnest, and presently were just inside a rhododendron bush on the very lip of the water, which stretched from right and left in a long and very beautiful lake of deep water. It was not much more than 100 yards across, but it gave to Kay the illusion of great depth, and of being very evil. It was so dark, being fringed on both sides by beautiful trees, nearly all dark. "I say," Kay said, "what a place." "It gives me the fantods," Peter answered. "I don't like this place." "Well, we've come here now," Kay said. "Do let's examine it before we go." A little to the right of where they were, saw among the trees the roof and part of a building, and what was either a boat or a bathing house. Anyway, to the left, about 500 yards from where the lake came to an end in some tumbled rocks and boulders. Beyond this the ground rose with shrubberies and ornamental trees, and beyond the trees there were the buildings, seemingly of great extent, yellowish, Kay thought, as though built of Cotswold stone, which must have been imported there. From somewhere in the mass of these buildings, which were mainly screened by the trees, a little bell chimed gracefully for the half hour. "Now, I'm going along here to have a look at the house," Kay said. "Are you coming?" "No, I don't think I will, thanks," Peter said. "You go and look at the house if you like. I'll just go along and look at the boathouse, and to see if one could come here in the summer for a swim." "Well, do look out for yourself," Kay said. "That little clock has just chimed for 8:30. When it chimes for 9, you'll be inside the track we came by. You can easily take cover and wait for me." "All right," Peter said, "but I do wish you wouldn't go into this place. You'll get dropped on most frightfully hot if they catch you." Kay went along the path between the box trees, and he hadn't gone very far before he heard footsteps and voices coming towards him. He nimbly took cover between the path and the water, and listened as the voices and steps grew nearer. Peter could distinguish the voices of those who were approaching. He heard the unmistakably high voice of the foxy-faced man saying, "So you'll get them all in the soup? Ha ha, what?" And then something followed which Kay couldn't quite catch, but the next voice which spoke was undoubtedly that of Abner. "As so to the matter, sir," Abner said in his silky soft voice, "that's a question which we must wait until we've had our bathe and our breakfast. Perhaps they will be in better moods and more disposed to be reasonable after a good night's rest." The man passed where Kay was hidden without seeing him. The foxy-faced man said, "It'll be mighty cold. One plunge and then that'll be enough for me." "It will be exhilarating," Abner said. "By the way, I think I shall recommend 11 for service abroad. My head will be clearer after my bathe." Kay heard the men entering the bathing box a little distance from him, and he heard feet running upon the springboards, and 2 splashes, followed by splutterings, and the foxy-faced man was saying, "Ah, it's like ice water! Ha, what?" And Kay heard them crawling up the steps from the water, and Abner saying, "Enough for honour. We will leave the rest to the British." He heard them rubbing themselves down and muttering with clattering teeth that their blood would never run warm again, and soon they had their robes around them and were running back along the path from which they come. Kay went out from his hiding place and crept along in the direction in which they had gone, and presently he came to the end of the lake, the tumbled rocks and boulders. At first he could see no outlet to the waters, but then he heard above the sighing of the pine trees a sort of wash of water somewhere underneath his feet, and some water at any rate from the lake was falling into the passage underground. The path by which the bathers had come led above the tumble of rock, and it followed through a dense shrubbery and presently came into a thicket of laurel bordering on a drive. Through the laurel he could see the spacious mansion built in Cotswold stone, somewhere early in the reign of George III, on a foundation much older. He was looking directly across at double front doors within a portico. They were lofty doors, paned with glass to give light to the hall within, and as the morning sun now shining onto the grass, he could see something gleaming inside the hall. It looked like a suit of armour. The hall had the look of having been built on the main structure after it was finished, and while he watched there came from within the house the sweet banging of a gong. Almost immediately half a dozen men wearing black cloaks came out of the outhouses to the right of the house and passed through the front doors. "That's the gang," Kay said to himself, "or some of them, this college of young clergy, and the gong going for their breakfast, and I can creep in and see them while they're at breakfast." As the last of the men in the black cloaks passed under the portico, there came a loud hissing noise, somewhere between a whistle and an escape of steam from somewhere up in the air. The laurel was rather in the way of Kay's getting a good view, but he saw the men in black look up towards the noise, and looked up himself, and to his amazement he saw a silvery aeroplane poising just like a kestrel above the house. It had come noiselessly, and there it was hovering in a way that Kay hadn't thought to be possible for any aeroplane, and the whistle or hiss of steam was plainly a signal, for a moment later the aeroplane sank slowly down vertically, as though into the very body of the house. "I say," Kay thought, "whoever would have thought that an aeroplane could do that?" He thought to himself at once, "Well, I suppose that's the kind of aeroplane that scrobbled little Maria, and of course if they've got a thing like that they could do all sorts of things that nobody would suspect." "Now I wonder," he said, "if poor old Cole Hawlings and the bishop and maybe Caroline Louisa are shut up in the dungeons only a few yards away." Almost at once he listened as he heard a lot of men's voices singing together a familiar hymn. "Well, I don't know," he thought. "That sounds like a missionary college, but what would they want with Abner Brown, and what would they be doing with an aeroplane like that if they're only missionaries?" However, it was time to start back towards Peter, and as he crossed above the tumbled rocks he looked again, hoping to see some sort of opening amongst them. This time he saw what he ought to have noticed before, a sluice with its winch, beside which was a rusty iron grating, so covered with drift of different sorts that it could not easily be distinguished. The water seeped and trickled through this grating, and fell, as he judged, some little distance. "I would like to go down there on a rope," Kay thought, "with torches and explore." At this moment the bell above the missionary college struck 9 and chimed the hour, and Kay hurried to the agreed place where Peter was to be. But Peter wasn't there. Kay looked in the thickest cover near the agreed place, but there was no sign of Peter, and he'd certainly not entered the cover there. Kay waited some minutes thinking, "Well, Peter always was an ass. He never had much sense of time, and will go on wandering around and blunder into something." He waited a few more minutes, but Peter had not come, and then Kay thought, "Well, perhaps if he's gone on by himself, he will have left the patteran." He'd often played gypsies with Peter, and had read in one of George Borrow's books that gypsies put what they called a patteran, some sign or mark of leaves or twisted grass on the ground to show the direction that they'd taken. The agreed sign between Peter and himself was a handful of leaves squeezed and dropped on the ground. He looked on the path for such a mark, but could find none. "Oh, where has he gone?" he thought, and then he wondered. Well, what should I have done if I'd been in Peter's place? He'd probably got past the little bathing box and would have kept on the further side of the bathing box while the men were bathing. But what on earth would he have done then? He followed the path by which he thought Peter may have gone on his exploration, and presently a little brook ran across the path, and in the mud by the brook's bank were the mark of Peter's shoes. He did come this far, Kay thought, and he hasn't come back this way. Well, of course he wouldn't come back this way. It was the maxim of these young scouts to never come back the way which they were in a strange or dangerous company. Presently the ground began to be very soft. A good many springs broke out there, and the channels by which they had fallen into the lake had allowed to become choked, and Peter's tracks were plain indeed. On the farther side of the soft patch the track turned a corner, and there, to Kay's horror, were 2 other tracks. 2 or 3 men had been there, and they were little fresh, unmistakable signs of rapid trampling and scuffling. There's no doubt about it, Kay thought. They've scrobbled Peter. Somebody's been here, and they've got Peter, just like that silly ass to go right into the lion's den. But if they've scrobbled Peter, what did they do with him? Where did they take him? They didn't take him to the house at any rate. They took him away from the house. And we'll see you again for the second part of chapter 8 tomorrow.